Welcome. Good to be here. Thank you for coming. My name is Jonathan Rowson. I am director of Perspektiva, and I have known Iain for 12 years, I realized today, and in that time come to understand his work, I hope, and certainly enjoyed his work and have found a great deal of importance in it. And we're the very proud publishers of The Matter with Things, which is an extraordinary book over 2 volumes, and the paperback has just come out officially today. So tonight's event is partly a way of marking the, I don't know if it's still a launch when it happens the second time, but the kind of the re-enchantment of the book through the act, let's say. And Perspektiva, for those who don't know, we think that based on the data we could receive from who's joining tonight, roughly a third of you are familiar with Perspektiva, and maybe roughly 2/3 not so much. We are a charity based in London, although our reach is quite global because of the digital world, and we have staff that are outside of London as well. We are funded primarily by the Fetzer Institute in the USA, and I say that now because that's what makes tonight's event being free possible. That and an additional funding that we've received, particularly for this event. And Perspektiva, it's worth just saying a few things about it to contextualize why we're interested in Iain's book and what the series is about. So we sometimes call ourselves an urgent 100-year project. And it's interesting when you say that. Some people hear the 100 years and think that's far too long. And the point of saying it's an urgent 100-year project is deliberately to get to that problem of sort of playful paradox being somehow the reality of things. That we think that we do urgently need to rethink the world, reimagine the world, reconceive the world. But at the same time, it's not something that is in kind of action panic mode. We're not in the business of trying to put fires out as such. We're trying to reconceive the world from first principles and give intellectual permission and social permission to people who want to try to reimagine how the world might be, not just next year, but in 10 years or in 100 years. And that kind of work often takes quite a philosophical dimension, but a lot of our work is also applied. We do a lot of sort of social innovation of various kinds. And we're, of course, a publisher. So there's more to say, but if you'd like to understand Perspektiva better, someone can put in the chat our website, and do have a look around. Although tonight's event is free, you are very welcome to make a donation if you're interested in the work we do already, or if you're becoming interested. And later after this event, we'll be asking if you want to sign up to our work and get to know us better. So first of all, welcome. And I'm very grateful to Iain for making it possible to have so many of you here. So this series is called Attention Attention as a Moral Act. And I want to just draw your attention to a line in the first book here. They're big tomes, so it just takes a second to come to it. But Iain, for those of you who don't know Iain's work, and I'm assuming we're working on the assumption that you mostly do, he says here, we'll just find it. Yeah. It's not a small claim. Iain says this right at the beginning of the introduction. I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality. I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality and chosen to ignore or silence the minority of voices that have intuited as much and consistently maintained that this is the case. Now we have reached the point where there is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves. Attempting to convey such a richer insight is the ambition of this book. So he sets himself a very high bar that we've systematically misunderstood, misrepresented reality. And what's interesting for me as a civil society, leader of a civil society organization is, many people ask how to make Iain's work relevant. And this is a non-trivial task. As someone who's been alongside it in some way for 12 years, it's not as simple as because Iain says X, the policy should be Y. It's never that simple. But Iain's comment there does point to this quality of kind of the need to reconceive who we are and what we're living for at a very fundamental level to have a chance of surviving and thriving in the 21st century and beyond. So the stakes are kind of high. So the combination of the really high stakes, but often the quite deeply philosophical content, makes it a particular kind of discussion. You know, it's important for me. Our job here in this series is to try to move the conversation towards people beginning to perceive it and experience it and understand the view of the world presented in these books in a way that allows them to act differently, not as kind of premise to conclusion, but as a shift of perception, a kind of metanoia, a sort of completely new frame of mind that allows them to live differently, to prioritize differently, and so on. So that's what this series is about. And we call it Attention as a Moral Act, to get to that feeling of it matters how you attend to the world. And these books help to explain both what that means and why. And we're going to have, we already have scheduled for 2 weeks' time, Zach Stein. And then laterally, soon after that, we have Phoebe. Zach Stein will be speaking about valueception, the notion of value as being something that you can actually perceive, a very profound notion in Iain's work. Phoebe Tickell will be grappling with imagination. She's an imagination activist, she calls herself, so she'll be interested in the kind of theoretical basis of her work. Bonita Roy will be speaking about the notion of what it means for a society to be insane, whether we are in some meaningful sense insane. The book's subtitle, as you may know, is Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. So this notion of what it means to be deluded at scale will be that focus. And then we also have a discussion on the physics in Iain's book with a physicist, Philip, Iain, remind me of his second name.
Philip Goyle.
Philip Goyle, that's right. Philip Goyle, who will get into the sort of the depth of the physics that underlies some of Iain's theorizing. So that's ahead. And then we have another 6 or so after that. And we want this conversation to go on to try and really tease out from unusual places what to make of Iain's work. Like how does it help us reorient to the situation the world's in at the moment? So that's all going on. And I think I've mentioned everything essential. So the first question, really, I want to speak to Iain tonight about something I call the McGilchrist maneuver, half in jest, totally in earnest. But we're going to come to that a little bit later. The first thing I want to do really is, most people here know Iain as a talking head, perhaps from Channel McGilchrist, perhaps from a lecture, and they'll know his writings from his books. But there is an intellectual formation story. Iain sometimes gives the impression of being a polymath, but it wasn't always thus. And so I'm interested in if you could please, slowly but surely, yet somewhat quickly, talk us through the key turns of your intellectual formation, because you appear to have this sort of polymathic erudition, and I suppose I'm interested to know where it came from.
Well, as with all polymathic erudition, it's probably not as exciting as it looks, but it started in childhood. I was a very, I was going to say curious child, and that's probably true as well. I was interested in many things. My father was a doctor, but it was mainly my mother's father, my grandfather's interest in science that fired my imagination. As a child, I used to love going to stay with him and being. He showed me many fascinating things in science in the workshop, in the garden, and so on. That made me think, wow, this is something I really need to know more about. And I suppose that was the general drift of my intellectual life until I. At the age of 12, which is, of course, a very important turning point for everybody, I got to be at a school where I could explore many things. And I've really always been philosophically minded. There were a number of things that occurred to me and seemed terribly important that were different from what everyone taught me, or what everyone seemed to imply at any rate. And these were things like the whole is never the same as the sum of the parts. When I used to say this to people, they'd say, well, what is this magical something extra that goes in there? And at the time I felt, that's all very well, but it's not quite right. But I couldn't articulate it at the time. I can't now, I think. I thought that the world was not a sort of unresponsive lump of matter. It was a deeply responsive, vibrant, living, reverberative experience, in that whatever it was a two-way process between the world around me, particularly the natural world, and me. I thought that opposites were not necessarily as far apart as people seem to think. In fact, I started to think that opposites often seem to coincide, and that the further you push something, the more you approach the very thing you're fleeing from. I thought that history generally seemed to move in spirals, not in a sort of linear trajectory. And I thought that the general tendency of the analytic mind that was very much prized in my education was to take things, abstract them, decontextualize them, and render them no longer unique and alive. And this was an odd thing, because doing this was important. It was definitely what we did, and I seemed to be good at it. But I also thought, this is not enough. And then
You were 12. I mean,
I ought to mention
those thoughts are arising when you're 12, or is that rather when they began to arise?
No, I would say probably about 13 or 14. And what happened at the school I was at, Winchester College, was that you did your O-levels in the first term, or at least by the end of the third term, the end of the first year. So at age 12, when I got one's O-levels out of the way, and the rest of the time was free to really explore many things. And there were three strands to it. One was a science ladder, one was a humanities, i.e. the history and languages, and the other was the classics. And everybody had to, whatever they chose as their special area, they all had to do a hard core that never dropped, things like mathematics, history, English, and so forth. And I started off, in short, by jumping onto the science ladder, because that seemed to me the thing that was most interesting. And I very quickly found, as my mind unfolded, and as as I became slightly more of a mature person than I was at 12, that things like history and literature were vastly important. So I hopped to that one, and then finally I hopped to the classics ladder, so that rather unusually I managed to straddle all three of these things. I've never been able to seem to make up my mind about what it is I particularly want to specialize in. And then I wanted to go to Oxford to study philosophy, and particularly the kind of philosophy that was not the terrifically dry splitting of hairs, but the kind of philosophy that saw into the depths of things and had a place in it for the idea of a God. Because I came from if I can put it this way, from a godless household. I mean, one in which we never went to church. My parents didn't talk about that kind of thing. To being in my teens struck by the force of what one can only call the sacred in nature, in music, in art, and in the fellowship and community in which I lived. So I was changing at that point, but I'd always wanted to do philosophy. And as I say, I was excited because in Oxford there was a course called Philosophy and Theology, which was just what I wanted to do. So I did the exam and I went up for interviews. And I had to do the exam in some school subject, which just happened to be English literature. And the people who interviewed me said, "Oh, you can't do philosophy and theology. It's not an honours degree." So in 1971, philosophy and theology was not even an honours degree at Oxford. There's a simple reason: it had only just been founded, and I don't think it had had time to acquire that status. But they said, instead, you must do PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. And I'm sorry to say this to somebody like you, Jonathan, who's learned and excited by both philosophy and by both politics and economics. I'm not particularly. And I wanted the other thing. And they said, well, look, I don't want to do that. So they said, well, look, come and do literature, because it's quite philosophical if you want it to be. And so I did. I read English literature. After I'd got my degree, I was then encouraged to sit the exam for All Souls College, which is an odd college. It doesn't have any students, not graduates, not any kind of students. It's really just a kind of an intellectual hothouse for people who can be assumed to be somewhere near the head of their game. And it was a very exciting 7 years I had there. When I arrived there...
1 second, before you got admission, I want to pause there because I happen to know something that's of interest to the audience maybe. I took the exam myself, I believe, in 2001 and did not pass.
Oh.
But I do remember they, at that time, had one of the 5 papers being a single word essay question.
Yes.
And the one I did was diversity, which is quite curious given the current world.
Yes,
but
yes.
What's also curious is I believe yours was on evil.
Correct.
And do you remember what you said about evil that got you admission to All Souls?
Well, I wouldn't have remembered, but a philosopher, Derek Parfit, was a colleague who was so taken with that essay that I wrote that he photocopied it. And when I became a fellow, he gave it to me. So somewhere in a box in the attic, if I could ever find it, there is that essay. I was alarmed because I sat in this room with, I suppose, 20 people. We were competing for at maximum 2 fellowships, and very often one or none were appointed. And in the room, people started to write after 5 or 10 minutes. And I sat there and I was sort of thinking. Half an hour went by. I could see everyone scribbling. I still wasn't writing. 3/4 of an hour went by. And finally, at 2 hours, I was just so, if you like, wired. I just thought, I've got to write. And I just did in that hot fire of the pressure of time. Anyway, that was that. It's an extraordinary exam. I hope it's not that too different these days. It seems to me to be able to try and take in people who are not just very good at their special thing, but actually can think broadly about many topics. So there were general papers. It
was you who told me that they did away with the 1-word question in the exam.
I think they have done. I think they have.
The quality had decreased so much that they weren't sure it was worthwhile.
I don't know if that's the case. I think that was the case with the language. There was a language paper where you just had to translate as many pieces as you could in 3 hours from Greek, Latin, German, Spanish, French, Russian, and Italian, I think it was. Anyway, I think they stopped doing that. I'm sorry about the essay because I think it was a real test of something. A kind of ability to think broadly and differently. But they do still have, I think, the special subject papers alongside general papers. So you could be, doesn't matter what subject you're taking the exam in, you have to answer some general questions. Anyway, there it was. And when I got to All Souls, I had planned to do a thesis on 18th century literature and ideas, the transition from the Enlightenment to Romanticism. But a number of people, but most vocally, again, Derek Parfit, a very, very considerable philosopher, I think by most people considered the greatest philosopher of his generation, had started as a historian. And he said to me, you don't know where you may want to go. Don't do that. You've been given something very special. You can do a doctorate at any college, but you've been given 7 years in which you can do anything and there'll be no questions asked. You can read what you like. So I did. I spent that time doing a lot of things. I read a lot of science, of course, but I also read philosophy, went to philosophy seminars and other things. I found myself a Russian teacher and so on. So that just generally broadened my horizons. But I began to think at the end of this, what am I going to do next? I don't want just to go into some sort of normal academic rut. There's something wrong with the way we studied literature. And I wrote a book called Against Criticism, published by Faber in 1982, in which I laid out the philosophical basis for why the academic study of literature is somehow vitiated. It destroys the very thing it's trying to get hold of. Anyway, I won't go into that, except to say that in brief, I thought there were 3 important things about, say, a poem, was that somebody in the past wrote something that they thought was very meaningful and important, so important that they poured some very they suffered in order to produce this thing. And along we came with our clever, sneering attitudes from the 20th century and sort of encouraged to deconstruct it in certain ways. But more importantly, what happened was that we abstracted something that was deeply contextual and embodied. We generalized something that was unique. And we lost the sense of the living thing that we were looking at, that is unique, embodied, and implicit. And in the process of analyzing it, we'd taken this importantly implicit material out and made it explicit. And that's as deadly as explaining a joke. Explaining a poem is, death to the poem. So I wanted to move on, and I got very interested in this issue, what was wrong. And it struck me that it was to do with the mind-body problem, that we neglected the body. And I was familiar with the philosophers. I went to their seminars and heard what they had to say about the mind-body problem. But it seemed to me they were just too disembodied in their approach. And so I thought I ought to do something more embodied about this. And at that time, Oliver Sacks had just published Awakenings, which was one of the many sort of real milestones in my intellectual development, because here was somebody who related illness to an analysis of what we are when we are well and healthy, who related what was going on for an individual person, beautifully realized in his text. And he was able to see in it general truths, general philosophical truths through that highly individual vignette. And that most of what he was saying was actually in the footnotes. It was as it were, as implicit as it could be. So anyway, I thought, well, I want to be somebody like Oliver Sacks. And that meant going to medical school, learning neurology, and going into psychiatry in the overlap area between neurology and psychiatry. So I did that. I became a doctor.
Just to slow down to summarize for a second, just because you seem to be saying two things there. One is, in a very real sense, your first book on literary criticism prefigured The Master in His Hemisphere that came much later. There's a very clear overlap in the kind of concerns you had. And the second is that
which even went back to my adolescence at school. Yes.
Right. And the second thing is that there's a very clear figure of admiration that sort of propelled you forward into a way of looking at the person, scientifically and philosophically.
There have been.
I just wanted to make sure
been a number of days. Yes. Now I'm worried about just taking up too much time with this.
It's worthwhile because people don't know these. My sense is they don't know these things, and it's good to get your work in the round. So then you go to medical school, and later become a psychiatrist, and particularly you went to Baltimore, right? And there brain scan things happened.
That's right, but perhaps just before that, I should say that I was at the Maudsley Hospital in London, the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital, which is a great British teaching hospital. They would like to think the greatest British teaching hospital in that area. And I heard a lecture there one day by a man called John Cutting, who became another influential figure for me. He'd just published a book called The Right Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders with OUP, Oxford. And anyway, I almost didn't go to this lecture, but thank God I did, because in it he talked about the differences between the hemispheres, which are nothing like what I'd heard in the pop psychology stuff that is all too widely, or used to be all too widely believed. I think I've done something to erode that now. But what he was saying was that the left hemisphere doesn't seem to be able to understand what is implicit. It understands what is explicit. So it doesn't get tone of voice, humor, metaphor, irony, sarcasm, the facial expression, bodily posture, all the ways in which we communicate meaning. Secondly, it tends to categorize. So it takes the unique thing and it categorizes it so that the uniqueness is lost. It becomes a representative of a type. And the third thing that I remember was so relevant was his saying the right hemisphere is literally more in touch with our embodied being for a number of reasons I don't need to mention, but to do with its more rich connections to the limbic system and its relationship to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Anyway, that fascinated me. I went to talk to John afterwards, and I then began some research on hemisphere differences. And then I went to Baltimore, and I was able to join a research group in which people were looking at hemisphere differences. This was very exciting for me. And I became involved in researching into the abnormal symmetry or asymmetry in the brains of people with schizophrenia. So in the normal brain, there is a reliable finding that the left hemisphere is broader and bigger towards the back and the right hemisphere broader and bigger towards the front. But in schizophrenia, this is often either absent or actually reversed. And interestingly, the very parts that get affected by this are the parts that underwrite some of our most important capacities for making sense of the world. They're what's called heteromodal association cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, and parts of the cingulate. So these things are very important, and they are abnormal in this condition. And that was terribly exciting. I was able to map these things and take part in research into it. But I also, at the same time, received an excited missive from John Cutting saying, you must read a certain book. It's absolutely essential to everything you and I are concerned about. And it was Louis Sasser's book, Madness and Modernism. And its subtitle is Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought. And this extraordinary book, extraordinarily clearly and beautifully written, is the product of a mind that was able to range over many things, over literature, over philosophy, obviously over psychology, and over the visual arts. And what he seemed to show was about 20 to 25 aspects of modernism, if you like, the culture of the 20th century mainly, and postmodernism that overlapped with elements in the experience of subjects with schizophrenia. And I kind of knew this as soon as of course. It was really the most beautiful moment at which something happened to me that people say happens when they tell me now when they read my work, which is kind of course, I've sort of realized this, but had no way of articulating it. Anyway, I mean, obviously it couldn't be that we'd all suddenly got schizophrenia. We haven't. But what seems to have happened is that we have ignored the input of the left hemisphere. People with left hemisphere overdrive or right hemisphere deficits look at the world very much in the way that people with schizophrenia do. They become, frankly, deluded. And that's why the word delusions is important in the subtitle of the book, The Matter with Things, because I really believe that we are now in a world in which we have lost touch with what the right hemisphere could have told us. And we are becoming deluded about what we are, what the world is like, and so on. So that is some of my intellectual evolution. All these influences were very important. And I spent the next, I suppose, 20 years writing The Master and His Hemisphere. So that really takes you up to the beginning of that one.
So, okay, great. Thank you. Well, I hope that was useful for people. It certainly is for me. And like you said, that takes you up to the publication of The Master and His Emissary, which I believe you took about 20 years to write, although you were working at the same time, I suppose.
I was working about 55, 60 hours a week at the time. And it only took me 10 years to write the longer book, The Matter with Things, but I was writing full time.
Right. You also, yeah, okay. And so then the Master and His Emissary came out to mostly critical acclaim, although some critical aspects of that too, but mostly acclaim. And then a documentary was made about your work by Vanessa Dillon, and you've been on shows with, I don't know, John Cleese and various other people that are very well known household names. How do you feel fulfilled, Iain? Do you feel like you're like at a personal level you've done your work in this world?
That's an interesting thing. I think the answer is I can't help being delighted, touched, and filled with a sense of, yes, of something having gone right. When people tell me what my work means to them. That is the important thing. And it's not, yes, I've been on all the chat shows and I've met the various people, but it's actually when individual people that I didn't know write to me in the loveliest terms, saying what a difference this has made to their life, not just to their intellectual life, their thinking, but also to their relationships, to their work, to everything. And that is, I think, is the thing that fulfills me. That is the moment. That is when I say, okay, it's all worthwhile.
Okay, so I can tell you what it means to me. Now it's a good segue to get to what I felt recently. So as you know, Iain, I read the entire manuscript of The Matter with Things, including all of the appendices and notes, which all inclusive, I believe, comes to quite close to 1 million words, if not actually there, when you factor in absolutely everything. And I read quite a lot of it on train journeys. I think I said in the launch party of the event that there was a time when I knew I had to interview you about the book, and I was struggling to read with my job and family, just finding the time to read it. So I actually created excuses to go up and down to Scotland a few times to meet extended family and made it sound like it was all about them. And it was, but it was also about getting myself chunks of 5 hours each way to read the book. Anyway, while reading it, I noticed something that kept recurring. And it was as if it was a musical note that you hear come into a song every so often. And at the time, I couldn't quite place it, but we spoke a bit about it when I was on Sky. And it had a certain kind of pattern to it that I've latterly called the McGilchrist maneuver. And since then, I've been reading the book more closely. And I think the heart of the McGilchrist maneuver, insofar as it means something, is the primary hypothesis of what you call the hemispheric hypothesis, which is broadly the brain functioning well, presencing, or allowing the world to presence itself to our own kind of appraisal and perception, then a kind of imperceptible shift towards left to sort of make sense, categorize, and understand, then a sort of shift back to the right, no longer quite the same for having received the input of the left. So the first McGilchrist maneuver is a kind of right, left, right of that form. But then there's a more subtle one, which is a little bit more analytical sounding, but it's very useful for public conversations because you hear a lot of people saying, you're thinking in a too binary a manner. It's not either or, it's both and, right? It's a very common refrain. You hear it a lot in sort of popular culture even. And what your argument suggests, and you're not probably the first to say this, but you say it particularly well, and it falls out of the hypothesis well, is that it's not so much that it's either or both and. It's in some meaningful sense either or and both and, but not to the same extent, right? And that's the kind of, like, it's many layers of subtlety in that. But you begin to see this in several different parts of the book, and where the heartland of that maneuver lies, the kind of source code of it, is in chapter 20. Chapter 20 of the book, I can say to people watching this, is the business. If you want to read one chapter of this monumental work, honestly, and if you've got a glimpse of the argument in general terms already, as most of you have, either from the prior book or just watching a video or whatever, I think you can understand chapter 20 by itself without much other information. You need to know something about the hypothesis, but not that much. Chapter 20 for me is like the hinges on the door between the sort of scientific and philosophical appraisal and the sort of cultural implications. And for those who don't know, chapter 20 is rendered into simple English as the coincidence of opposites. But the word coincidence, as Iain points out in the book, has somewhat been tainted. But nonetheless, so you use the Latin, I guess, how do you say it?
Coincidentia oppositorum.
That's the one, right? Thank you. And this is really a beautiful, beautiful chapter, because I think that if people who are on a slightly more applied side of things, working in civil society organizations, concerned about climate change, interested in how the arts can influence culture and thereby influence behavior or whatever, in chapter 20, I think we see a shift in perception that is really generative of a different way of viewing the world and acting in it. And I say this knowing that earlier in the book, in the first volume, you begin the book by targeting reductionism. Reductionism is kind of the public enemy number one in the first part of the book. And I think more precisely reductive materialism. And you make a very good, strong case on that, and that stands on its own terms and it has its own validity and so on. But I think actually for people in the public realm, trying to fight against reductionism with something more holistic of the kind you offer is not necessarily as powerful as recognizing this McGilchrist maneuver in chapter 20, because what happens there is the enemy there is not so much reductionism, it's actually the law of non-contradiction. Now, the law of non-contradiction basically says, you know, it can't be night and day, you can't be right and wrong, it can't be black and white. And this chapter basically says, actually, it can. And in many, many meaningful senses, not only can it be this, but this is the beating heart of reality. These opposites that are in some kind of meaningful relationship with each other actually are closer to the heart of things than the law of non-contradiction would ever be. And if I could just read a few of the statements you make. For example, you speak about the non-duality of duality and non-duality. I'll just get my notebook, which fell under the table. 1 second. You speak about the non-duality of duality and non-duality. You speak about the unity of unity and multiplicity. And you also speak somewhere very profoundly, this is the thing I want to ask you about now, because it relates back to your All Souls essay on evil indirectly, is you speak about the equal necessity but unequal status of spiritual opposites.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you're getting at, it comes from the myth that you begin the second volume with, but it also speaks to the perennial battle between good and evil. And again, the McGilchrist maneuver here is very valuable, because what you seem to be saying is it's not that it's the world's either good or bad. It's not either or. It's not simply that it's good and bad. That's not quite right either. It's that it's good and bad, and it's somewhat more good than bad for particular reasons. That's how I read it. So please tell me how you see
it. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is to anybody who hasn't read the book, I'm not sure, apart from really in that opening myth, which is just absolutely staggering, which is something I learned about, comes from an Iroquois people called the Onondaga. And it's unfortunately too long to go into now, but it is the most stunning introspective understanding of how the right and left hemispheres work together. That's the way I would look at it. I don't really talk about the spiritual much. I address that in the last chapter, 28, because I don't want to lose my audience along the way. And I know how all the misconceptions that surround the idea of the spiritual, the divine, and the sacred will lose people. But I want very strongly to show them that if they follow where I've been and you see the world in a different way, there's nothing that's irrational or unintelligent about embracing this idea. There's something very important about it. And I do in that chapter 28, at the end of the book, I do briefly talk about the nature of evil, but it's just a very personal thing. I can't believe the idea that evil is simply a kind of lessening or falling away of good. I think it has its own dynamism. I think it's real and to be reckoned with. And I think that this is part of the whole picture of the cosmos, which is that there are different drives, if you like, that are both needed. And the intellect may try and get rid of one or diminish one, but actually that's just cheating. And so when I talk about the coincidence of opposites, and I use the Latin term coincidentia oppositorum, simply because it was the way in which it was first talked about by Nicholas of Cusa, a very interesting philosophical, scientific-minded cardinal in the 15th century, and by Jung, who I think is enormously important here. And as a psychiatrist, I can vouch that, however good you think you are, there is a dark side, and that dark side is very important, and recognizing it is enormously important. The failure to recognize it and understand it leads to damage, destruction, and disease. And so it's a hugely important thing for each of us individually, but also for a society as a whole, to realize that in pursuing headlong some very simple goal that looks to you perfectly good, you're destroying all kinds of other things that may be very important. And if you push it too far, you may actually achieve the very opposite of what you intend. I mean, a very obvious case of this is that anarchy leads to tyranny.
Right.
So we need, what I'm definitely not saying is, and people might say, oh, well, if he's saying something about the coincidence of opposites, doesn't that leave us unable to say anything about anything? Because really anything and its opposites are true. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that context greatly matters, and that these things share in some important way their qualities. So we need not, in fact, to reach, and we must essentially never reach the position where we've abolished both of these and just substituted some warm, mediocre soup somewhere in the middle. My point is we need to hold both of these realities maximally, and yet hold them together. And this is beautifully imaged in a whole range of ways in the philosophy of Heraclitus, pre-Socratic philosopher, for me, the most important philosopher in the West, anyway, that ever lived. And he has this image of a lute string or a lyre string, and also the string of a bow that shoots an arrow. And his point is that it needs to be pulled in opposite directions, and its very nature, its very power to do anything at all, to give a note, to let the arrow fly, comes from that tension being held. Now, that is one of the many things we don't perceive. Right. We also don't perceive that reality has this circular or spiral-like. I prefer spiral-like because, in fact, it doesn't circle back to where it was. It circles back to somewhere that seems rather like it, but is now higher up the spiral because things have happened, time has moved on. But that is an ancient image too. Empedocles thought that love and strife were the two elements that caused the world. And it's there in many philosophies around the world. We can't do away with one and just have the other. As Alan Watts said, we can't just have the peaks and not have the valleys. Right. We don't get that right. We don't understand that progress is never linear, that you're curving back towards the very thing that you fear. And unless you watch out for it, you will go to the place you really don't want to go to. Right. That everything needs to be seen in context. And the way in which we talk now is to take things out of context. So all that could, in a way, if you like, be implicit in that chapter on the coincidence of opposites, and you found it.
Well, yeah, I know. But also the other thing that I was struck by when I read this by you earlier, you say very amusingly, but very pertinently here, that in your many talks, and you get lots of audience feedback and lots of questions, and you say the way you put it to me was, there are two things people want and they can't have either of them. And as I understand it, you can correct me on this, but the first is that they want one thing to be better than the other, first of all. So
they want the left hemisphere to be bad and the right hemisphere to be good, and that's not right.
They really want the goodie and the baddie. They want the kind of Manichaean right hemisphere. Let's all create a right hemisphere world and forget about the left hemisphere. Some kind of ditch. It's not that at all. But they also
not that at all
struggle with the idea that if there's two things that matter, that they necessarily matter equally.
Exactly.
Right. And these things, like these 2 points, I know that for you they're self-evident now, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I read this thinking, how can this book be translated into some form of praxis in the community, that I feel as though this kind of capacity to see that you can have two things that are both really important, but one is more important than the other, and yet they utterly need each other. It's actually a bit countercultural. It's not actually there as one of our sort of means of operation.
All the things I'm saying are countercultural because I believe our culture is founded on simplistic falsehoods. We've mistaken the nature of reality. That's what I'm saying. And there are, in the first 7 pages or so of The Matter with Things, I lay out all kinds of things that must strike people as very improbable.
Right.
That, for example, relations are prior to the things that are related. Get that, but I stand by that throughout the book. So, and just for one, but it's in the master. It's in the image of the master and his emissary.
Yeah.
The master needs the emissary and knows it. The emissary needs the master but doesn't know it.
Yeah. Right.
There's an imbalance in this relationship, and the emissary is good as long as it remains the emissary.
Right.
The master is good as long as the master remains the master.
Right.
But when the emissary tries to be the master, it falls apart. Now that image, I didn't know that. I only found out about it afterwards, and in the writing of The Matter with Things, is central to many cultures. There are examples in Chinese mythology, in Indian mythology, in North American native peoples' mythologies, and so on. Of this usurping force, and it's actually the subject of what is arguably the greatest epic poem in the English language, Paradise Lost. It is precisely the story. Right. So this is a very important one. That there's nothing wrong with the left hemisphere as long as it knows its limitations. But unfortunately, one of the features of being limited is that you are limited in your knowledge of your limitations.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that it's limited and it has to find its proper place and relationship. It's wonderful. It's glorious. It's an extraordinary capacity, right? And you're, with all due respect, I mean, people have said of your 2 volumes and almost 1 million words, it looks like the left hemisphere has won. But I think you would counter, I think, that this is in the service of the right, which is, also quite a valid contention.
Absolutely. I've spent my life struggling to bring the left hemisphere into service to what the right hemisphere knows. So it is quite true. The book is absolutely stuffed with real science, with hard science. There are 5,600 references in the new book. It goes much further than the master and his emissary in exploring this difference between the hemispheres, and nobody can say I haven't researched this properly. I don't think there are very few people alive in the world who would be in a position to have read more about it than I have. So there it is, and I use reason. Reason is my friend, not an enemy. It's just that not everything can be encompassed by reason. Reason can't explain why a wonderful piece of music is as wonderful as it is. There are intuition and reason are both important. And again, when I chose the master and his emissary as the metaphor, I didn't know that quote that is attributed to Einstein, that, the rational mind is a faithful servant and the intuitive mind is a precious gift. We live in a world which honors the servant but has forgotten the gift. Well, in the second part, the middle part, as you know, of The Matter with Things, I look at reason, science, intuition, and imagination, and basically suggest that all of these are very important in their different ways, and we need to be able to make use of them appropriately.
Right. Okay. All well taken. And as always with your book, there's a kind of hermeneutic kind of process going on in which you have to go over many different aspects of the argument again and again until the full picture becomes clearer. One of the things I was struck by, again, just focusing on chapter 20 for a second, if it is the case, and sorry, not if, it clearly is the case, you argue it well, it's very compelling, I believe it, that we live in a world of the coincidence of opposites, a world in which resistance is a critical feature of life, opposition is necessary, flow and movement are primary, and all of the things that you argue in the second volume. If that's the case, it's natural that we'll struggle to perceive that without the language forms to perceive it. So on the one hand, what you're getting is a lot of people broadly of the right hemisphere perspective intuiting that you're right. Of course, Iain's right. This is why your book's so successful. Have you read Iain's book? Yada, yada, yada. And yet, when it comes to trying to put it to work, without the language forms to actually render this back to the right hemisphere in a way that gives a fuller picture of context, we'll struggle. In that respect, I was very struck that there are at least 3 words in chapter 20, big words, and there's no lack of them in the books, that I feel people don't really know. And not only do they not know them, but the fact that they don't know them means they can't really perceive what they're pointing towards as well. So the first is hormesis. The second is synapses. Yes. Tell me about the finesse there. And the other, and I always struggle to say this, but the enantiodromia is another.
Yes.
Can you talk us through what those three words mean and why they matter, because I think we sort of need to know to get a sense of what we're talking about.
Hormesis is a term from physical chemistry originally, and it refers to the fact that something that is toxic in substantial doses may actually be healthful and health promoting in small doses. There are certain very obvious examples of this. One is digitalis, derived from the foxglove, which is extraordinarily poisonous, but has been used since the 18th century and is still the basis of the most effective treatments for heart failure. Arsenic, which has also been used for 2,000 years, in very small doses can be extremely healthful, though obviously large doses kill. And atropine, which is derived from deadly nightshade, can restore function to people with certain neurological diseases. But it was first described and probably is still most used in describing the effects of radiation, where large doses of radiation can obviously be damaging and cause cancers, but small doses of radiation can in fact be health promoting and can in fact prevent the development of cancers in laboratory animals. It's all to do with the scale. Now that is so important, because what was I saying earlier? If you push and push something, you lose it. And actually it says this in the Book of Changes, in the I Ching. He who doesn't know when he has achieved enough but pushes further loses it. So that is very important. And there's an interesting observation that makes it vivid here. When people were looking at the biosphere 2, which is an enormous protected environment, which was erected to see how plants and even animals would respond to being in this protected environment. They were puzzled by the fact that healthy trees tended to fall over before reaching maturity. And what they discovered in brief was that for a tree to grow, it needs wind. It needs the stress of the wind to develop what is in fact called stress wood, which is the core strength of that tree. And this is something that, funnily enough, although not presumably known in that form to Nietzsche actually says this in 1870 something, that in relation to human beings, that we need adversity. Yeah. In a very simple way, we need adversity because, as you know, I think that everything is in motion, and contrary to the Newtonian image that rest is the normal state and that motion is an aberration, motion is the normal state and rest would be an aberration if it could ever be achieved. But to achieve that, we need friction. Friction is the thing that stops motion. That's how you would describe it. But it is also the thing that enables something to get started in moving. So that is hormesis.
One more thought on hormesis, Iain, before you get to synapses. For those of you who remember, there's a film called Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner, just to bring it to popular culture for a second. And the premise of this movie is basically a sort of white frontier pioneer person getting lost within a sort of Native American tribe. And at some point he's captured, and there's a kind of meeting around the fire to discuss what to do with him, whether to kill him, whether to send him back, and so on. And I'll never forget watching this, because one of the Native Americans is particularly aggressive and baying for blood. He says, we must kill him, we must kill him. And I remember thinking all the others are like passing the peace pipes and kind of, looking very quintessentially wise indigenous knowledge kind of picture. And yet this one guy is like a warrior saying, we need to take him out now. And I remember feeling at the time, it's really important that he's there. It's not that he's right, but there was something about that energy being in the room as a kind of counterweight to the, it's not exactly hormesis, don't get me wrong, but it's a similar spirit of this thing that's in a small dose valuable. If they were all like that, you'd have a different problem. And similarly, Iain, just to nail this point, you said to me, I believe, that you prefer your dark chocolate at 70%. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes,
and why
yes,
is
I
that?
do.
Can you please tell me, why is it 70%?
Because as you increase the percentage to 85 or 90, it becomes less pleasing. It's simply, this is why all the really best dark chocolate is 70% or 70-something%. The others are used for cooking because they're a purer chocolate essence, if you like. But there are many things. many
Sorry,
things that are like this. For example, in Scotland, you know, putting a lot of water in whiskey is considered a sacrilege. But a very tiny bit of water in the whiskey is necessary to enable it actually to unfold its inner richness.
Right.
And there's a joke I like, perhaps I may be indulged in it.
Of course.
In Scotland, that if you ask somebody, will you have water in the whiskey? The reply is, will there be room? Anyway,
Yeah.
perhaps I could talk about
incredulity. It'll be space for the water.
For the water. So let's move on to synapses. Synapses is in fact the Ionian or Ionic form of the word synapses in Attic Greek, which is the one that's best known to philosophers, but it's the one that Heraclitus used. And he has a fragment which is extraordinarily dense in my view, and it goes like this: synapses, and the word is graspings in English, graspings, wholes and not wholes, convergent, divergent, consonant, dissonant, from all things one, and from one thing all. And I think that is just extraordinarily rich. I mean, first of all, this idea of the word synapsis or synapsis is something to do with a sudden comprehension, grasping in that sense. It brings things together, the other idea of, coincidence, and it also signifies fertility, which comes about through the coming together of the gametes of the two sexes. So it says many things at once about this deep nature of reality, that it comes in glimpses or graspings, moments of insight, and that in that insight it's neither simply single nor simply manifold, neither simply whole nor simply not whole, neither simply like nor simply unlike. Each thing, as I say, working with and by the same token working against the others. The one and the many may bring things into reality. They bring one another forth into being, generating a reality that has this structure at its core. Right. And that despite, or in the light of all this, perhaps because of the nature of this multiplicity, all is held together in a synapsis. The only word here that's not paired with an antithesis. So I think that idea is very rich. And I know what you're saying is, so how do we get that into dialogues in places where people are making decisions? I think the first thing is that we need to emphasize that while we are busily pursuing a single goal, we're neglecting all kinds of other things that are disappearing as fast as we're achieving that goal. That we need, therefore, to be very measured and see how far we should go and not go further than that, lest we destroy. Yeah. That we need to respect the fact that when we bring things together, they remain unique and individual. This is not an abolition, so that when a society is cohesive, it doesn't somehow destroy the individual, but actually enhances the individual. The individual can only be fully an individual with the background of an integrated society. That, for example, when we move towards the future, we need to remember where we've come from in the past. We need not to jettison the knowledge that was painfully acquired by thousands of years across the world. People now, without even knowing what they're rejecting, are too quick to say, well, we can make something new. Yes, we can. Things are always new. A river is always new. A plant is always growing. Everything is growing and changing. Everything flows, as Heraclitus said, but you don't just cut it off from its roots. So all of these things are things that are worth saying. I think rehabilitating intuition is important. We haven't got time to go into all of that, but I have three whole chapters on intuition. But this constant, dismissing of intuition is a mistake, I believe. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something.
Well, just that I wanted to hear also, before sort of making sense of what these things mean together, but a little bit on enantiodromia as a why, why
yes,
use this concept as well.
Well, enantiodromia is the easiest one to deal with. It's a term invented by Jung, and it really refers to the fact that the roads go in two directions. And this was first again commented on, at least in the West, by Heraclitus, when he said the road up is the road down. So this is really the essence of enantiodromia. We don't need to spend much time on it, but I think that it is very beautifully, deeply, and with great imagination, and I mean that in the best sense, unfolded by Jung in his looking at what a human being is. And it's a very important element, as I say, in the practice of anyone trying to help a human being with their suffering, their mental suffering.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just struck by these three terms when I was reading, because they're not the kinds of things we bring to bear, right? We use language of like systems change, and we speak about regenerative economics, and we speak about a new narrative and all this kind of stuff. But these things cut much more deeply into the need to perceive reality. We live in arguably a reality avoidant culture. Much of reality we don't want to attend to in a certain way, and some would say it's also a kind of post-truth culture. But in order to sort of reach towards the truth and reach towards reality, it feels like our conceptual maps are not fit for purpose. There's a linguistic drought of some kind that prevents us from seeing. I'm not saying that we should resuscitate these fairly scholastic terms as the only way of doing it, but it does feel to me a little bit like part of the public education is to bring such terminology to bear so that people can actually make sense again of what's actually real and true, rather than feeling they can't actually articulate their intuitions.
Well, yes. I mean, whether or not these particular terms are the right ones, I wouldn't like to say, although there's nothing wrong with them, I suppose. But I think that the perception from which they stem is explicable in terms that are not so strange. And I suppose that's what I've tried to do in my writing, which is why one of the commonest things people say is, you gave me the words for things that I knew to be the case, but I had no language. I had no way of saying these things, and I felt I'd be dismissed if I said them. But I've given good groundings, reasons, and science behind why these things are important. And we need to make this shift. We need to change our perspective on what we're doing here and who we are and what the business of being alive is about before it's too late. Anyway, there we are.
Well, just a related example is, if you watch the news and the clamor on social media and the main forms of debates in public life, there's ubiquitous partial truth, right? People say things, and then there's a kind of whataboutery that's partially true, and there's a whataboutery response that's also partially true, but there's very little sort of shared endeavor to get to the kind of fuller vision of the truth. Now, there's a Whitehead quotation somewhere in your book about there are no whole truths, or only partial truths, or I'm not sure if he said
exactly.
But I feel this is quite fundamental. Again, it's something to do with being like realizing that to actually have a partial truth is in some sense the truth. It's sort of, there is a meaningful way in which not to know everything is to know everything, and you're getting towards that in your book, but in a way that is maddeningly elusive at a cultural level.
Well, I mean, I do talk about the importance of not knowing, which of course is not the same as ignorance. Yeah. Ignorance is what you have before you know. Not knowing is what you have after you've gone through the process of knowledge. Sure. So all that is very true, and what the Chinese call wu wei, non-action, is as important. And that is in a very practical sense. People are always saying, what do we do? And one of the things that comes out of experience as a psychiatrist is the first thing is to see what it is that you're doing that's wrong and stop doing it. Right. So before you can actually have room to do something new, you've got to get out of the picture the thing you're doing, which is wrong. So, I mean, all this has very practical meaning, in my view. It's not just some strange insight into the structure of being. But if we are to survive and if we're to understand what we're doing, we do need to have some insight into the structure of being. And at the moment, our image of a reductionist, materialist mechanism is wrong on so many counts, and I give a lot of them in the book.
I mean, you've quoted Wu Wei, you mentioned Wu Wei there, the principle. In the book, you quote the Tao Te Ching a few times. You mentioned the I Ching. You're many things, but you're also a kind of Taoist, right? One way to understand
I am a Taoist.
Right.
I'm precisely a Taoist. Yes.
Okay. Not even, okay. That's good to know.
And I could be a Christian, and if I was, I'm probably a very bad one. But I find the Christian mythos and the Christian tradition phenomenally rich, and it's very, I couldn't say whether I am a Christian or not, but it's not incompatible with being a Taoist at all, or a Buddhist for that matter. Thomas Merton famously was Catholic, and
will let others pick you up on that. I just wanted to end by just briefly, for those who are curious. Today I wrote a little piece trying to get my head around what I meant by the McGilchrist maneuver a bit more clearly. And I've said here just a short definition for those who are interested. I say the McGilchrist maneuver entails the combined perceptual and conceptual capacity that transcends contradictions, disclosing the coincidence of opposites as generative of reality, thereby re-enchanting aspects of lifelong re-enchanting aspects of life long considered problematic, including tension and paradox. So there's a kind of, I think there's a real thing going on here in the underlying structure that is principally in chapter 20, but pervades the entire work. And we will go now to something else, but I suppose I want to say the whole series is called Attention as a Moral Act. Now, that's a whole other discussion, but just to end, please, why is attention a moral act? What, if it's not obvious already, how would you describe it?
Well, I don't think it is entirely obvious. And when I discovered that almost the foundational difference, probably the foundational difference between the two hemispheres is the very well-known fact that they pay attention in different ways to the world, it didn't altogether immediately strike me that I'd struck gold. That this was an incredibly important thing, because part of my training was, attention is a cognitive function, with memory and, other things. And it therefore gets reduced to a sort of mechanism of a kind. And I didn't realize how fundamental this is to being. The world that we know is the product of our attention. We cannot know a world that is not part of our attention. I must say, first of all, that I don't mean by attention the scrutinizing, self-conscious attention, but if it hasn't come to our attention at even an unconscious level, if we haven't imbibed it, then it can't be part of our experiential world. So I steer an important course, I think, which is, I say important because at the moment, yet again, there is a polarization going on in which either people believe the world is simply something that's made up in the individual mind. So this is postmodernism at its worst. It's certain kinds of philosophy, a kind of naive idealism. And the other is a naive realism, that the world is just stuff out there, and our knowing it makes no difference to what it is. Well, again, we don't have time for this, but how we attend to something, whether we attend to it, even within the world of physics, never mind in the world of philosophy and psychology, makes a difference to what we are experiencing. And it's a moral act because it means that we are not simply observers in this universe. We are creators in this universe. We co-create along with the universe and along with that divine logos or Li or Ta or whatever it is that is the ground of being. We are not just passive consumers. Once again, it is always a reverberative relationship. The thing I realized in my very early teens, that everything has this structure. And that therefore we have an impact on the world, making it what it is, really literally making it what it is. The ways in which we see it alter what will be there. We know that from quantum mechanics, as it's laughably called, or quantum field theory, as I prefer. But it is also part of our experience of the world. So how we see the world creates is a duty laid on us to pay the right kind of attention, a kind of nourishing attention that brings things into being, not the kind of attention that alienates and that cuts us off from that reality and therefore changes it and changes us. So it has an effect on the world, it has an effect on us, those who are doing the attending, a moral effect. You can make yourself a very dubious person by always adopting a stance of extreme remoteness. You can also get things wrong by engulfing yourself in things. So as always, it is a matter of finessing a harmony of positions that look opposed to one another, but are equally necessary, or at least both necessary. So that's what I mean by it. And I also mean that if we don't pay the right kind of attention to what we're doing in this world, and at the moment our attention is up for grabs from every kind of electronic device around us. And I don't think that we are taught any longer how to be quiet and still and concentrate on a piece of work, on reading or listening to a piece of music for an hour or two at a time. If we don't reconnect with this kind of attention, we will lose the world, literally. I'm not speaking in metaphors. We will lose this world. The world may carry on without us. But that would be very sad for certainly us, and possibly for the world, because I don't hate humanity. I think we've got things very, very badly wrong. But what humanity is something very, very special.
Well, thank you. And all of humanity is indeed special, and the work you've done is certainly very special. And I suppose on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for your decades of scholarship, and the fire that has propelled that is something that I think we all admire. And you've done, I feel as though when I asked you earlier if you feel fulfilled about your work, there's a sense in which you've clearly done with your talents what you alone could do in some meaningful sense. And that's also why I wanted to share the biography. And I think it's up to us as a broader population of people interested in your work, concerned about the world in various ways, to consider what it means to us and how we bring it into being. And with that in mind, we're going to move in that direction now. Beginning with, I'll pass over to my colleague, Michael Bredy, in a second, and we'll do a very short practice before we move into groups, and then we'll come back together where we'll have a chance to ask you questions, and I'll help to field them as well. Okay, so this is a pretty fundamental question from Paul Aitken. Paul, do you want to ask it? If you're there, can we see you? Or is that too difficult, Michael, to do that?
I can actually. It might be a bit of a challenge, but I can.
All right, let me just ask it then. If you don't mind, Paul. Sorry, we better if we ask you. I hope you understand.
I think that's me.
Okay, great. Let's hear from you then, Paul.
Hi there. Thanks very much. So my question relates to, how would you say that we could slow down and nurture the sort of attention that grows out of that slowing down in a world that seems to be speeding up, and with less and less time to sit for 3 hours with a piece of literature or enjoy? How do we reconcile the speed of the world as we perceive it with the necessity of slowing down within it?
Thank you. Relatively quickly, and just so we can get plenty of questions in.
Yes,
which is a bit ironic, of course, given the question, but there you go.
It's a very good question, and I think it is difficult. There have never been more pressures on people to do more things in less time. So the only thing I can suggest is that you stand out against that culture as much as you can. And it's built into many of the assumptions of the culture that it's better for everyone to be doing lots and lots of things. It might be better if we did fewer things, but did them with greater thought and depth. So I think one has to make some decisions. I mean, I'm not holding myself out as any kind of example of what to do. I'm not a good example of doing anything, but I have no television. I've found myself listening less and less to the radio. I hardly ever do actually listen to the radio, to be honest. And I have switched off alerts when emails come. I try to limit the times of day in which I will look at them. And I'm not on any of the social networks, but I have the luxury of a PA who does, and who therefore picks up messages for me. But if you haven't got such a person, on the other hand, you might not have quite as many many requests or questions. But I think it is difficult. I think it's rather like asking any kind of spiritual practitioner, how do you do this? And the answer is not some simple thing, but it's about embracing a certain relation to the world, and that's really what I'm talking about. So I think it's start from day one of thinking, what matters is my relationship to the world, to people, and so on, and all the things that interrupt and make more shallow my connections with them, my experiences of them, are to be resisted. Sorry, It's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's the best I can say.
Thank you, Iain. And I'm looking at these. Sorry, Paul. Thank you for your question. And I'm looking at these questions, all of which are kind of explosive in their own way. There's one about AI. There's one about war and peace. There's one about God. I'm wondering. To be honest, I want to ask this because it seems to me it's something that Perspektiva recently did an anti-debate about. It's a whole conversation, but if you're interested, look at Perspektiva anti-debate. This is a question from Christine Miskelly, and it says, in what sense might war be needed for the development of peace? What sense, if any, perhaps?
Well, gosh, it is a very good question. I don't think it is absolutely necessary, though some degree of difference, competition, conflict is also part of the process of collaboration. So, I mean, one of the things I say about the history of evolution, which is constantly projected as a simple warfare of all against all, is that it's not a bit like that. I mean, it's far more distinguished by collaboration and cooperation between species, but a degree of competition is also extremely healthful. And I suppose bringing it back to human war and peace, I would like to say I hope we can certainly avoid a war, but that nonetheless some degree of independence of states, but working together of states is important. The element of change that comes about when a country is plunged into a crisis can be extremely healthful. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche really, but it's true that the Second World War produced extraordinary advances in science and technology, some of which may not be good in themselves, but some of which very clearly were and have been used to great advantage. So once again, it's not all or nothing. But I hope that in the case of actual human war, it will be as little as conceivably possible.
Okay, thank you, Iain. Gosh, there's so many. Do keep your questions coming, just because we will keep a record of all of these. So one way or the other, these will be attended to through a moral act, as it were. And we probably won't manage to answer all of them now. However, there was one question that's very much of the moment that is a more challenging real-world question about AI from Pat Kane. Pat, do you want to frame that in your own vernacular?
Sure. Hi, Iain, I love your work, but this is a pressing question, which is to say, to what degree is computation a left brain phenomena? And what are the recent achievements in computation, which are basically sort of modeling and building on the precedent of a corpus? We all thought that machines, the one thing that machines wouldn't get anywhere near would be creativity. Or responsivity, maybe even that may be a more technical way to put it. But it seems that's one of the first things that they've come for. We thought they would be dealing with our routinized behaviors and liberating us from labor. What it seems to be doing is coming in at the kind of formulaic nature of human creativity and intellect itself. And that's what advanced AI has come to. Now, within the right brain, left brain, complicated dynamic, which Jonathan was at pains to say is complex rather than Manichaean. What's your perspective on advancing computation and what it does to our sense of appreciation for valuing of the human?
Wow. Well, first of all, to start with the rather limited and more focused, computation is a very left hemisphere element. And it's different from understanding. So it's clear that the left hemisphere can manipulate words and manipulate figures. But the right hemisphere is better able to understand the overall import of the words and the overall nature of what has been computed and what it means. So in other words, it doesn't have the degree of understanding of the right hemisphere, but it's able to carry out procedures. It's the difference between procedures and inhabited processes. So what we're seeing is an enormous, it is striking and troubling, I agree. But if you can compute so that you can get all the possible permutations and possibilities, and this is not the way the human mind works intelligently, but you can then single out certain elements. But I doubt that, I may live to eat these words, but I doubt very much that a machine can produce something that is more than mediocre in terms of creativity. The business of creativity comes out of the business of having a body, having a mortal life that is limited in extent, and having emotions, and I think, and being conscious. And there's no evidence that, well, clearly that they don't have bodies, they don't have emotions, but they could have consciousness. But I think that's a doubtful but not excludable possibility. But I don't think this is how great creative works are made. There was already a machine created by putting all the works of Bach into it and then asking the machine to sort of, out of this, randomly produce a new work of Bach. But the trouble is that although it could pass as, in the genre of Bach, it's not created by a genius, and it doesn't move one in the way that the works of Bach do, and speak to one in the way that the works of Bach do. Only a human being, a fellow sufferer, can actually do that.
Is that something to do, Iain, with, thanks, Pat, for the question, is it something to do with reverberation? I mean, you mentioned that this notion that we have a similar problem in the chess world about whether a computer can play a beautiful game.
Yes, quite.
Point. And there's something about feeling the other human being's creative act that is sort of non-negligible, difficult to reproduce. And just, you're so fond of the word reverberation that came to mind in your response to the question.
Well, there's no need whatever for a computer that's very good at playing chess to have any form of consciousness. I mean, that's just absolutely not required. All it has to do is do an immense amount of computing very fast, which would be a very stupid thing to do, which is why I reject the term artificial intelligence. It's not artificial intelligence. It's artificial information processing that can be done incredibly fast, much faster than humans can process information. But my God, knowledge is more than processing information. Understanding is more than knowledge, and wisdom is more than understanding.
Okay, thank you, Iain. You heard it here first. There's no such thing as AI. I'm just kidding. So, Emma, you had your hand up quite early, so you can go next, please. Emma Morrissey.
Hi, it's Emer, but don't worry, it happens all the time. First, I just wanted to say a big thank you. Your work has had a really profound impact on my life, so just to get that out of the way first, thank you.
Well, no, thank you very much.
I just wanted to ask about the role of creativity, because obviously a creative act, for example, writing, requires both hemispheres of the brain, like, so the right would be kind of free flow of ideas and the left involved in the editing process, for example. So I wanted to ask what you think the role of creativity could be as an antidote to the imbalance that we see in the world.
I think it's terribly important. I mean, I think we are almost definable as creative beings. And as you know, my philosophy is that we are here to help create reality, that we are, we're not just passive passers through of a slideshow. We are actually interacting with something. So we are creating all the time. And emphasizing that element is important, but it doesn't mean letting go of what the left hemisphere provides, which are the tools. So, for example, in order to be a good poet, you have to know your language, you have to understand how it works, and you have to have read a lot. In order to be a good composer, you have to know the rules. Well, I think you do. I mean, nowadays all the rules have been thrown out, but it doesn't necessarily produce wonderful works of art. But I think that a composer is at an advantage, let me put it that way, if he or she understands the structures of music, the nature of music, and the history of music. So I believe we create out of a living tradition of which we are the new members who will take it in another way or take it further. That is all brilliant. But what I reject is just cutting off the ways in which we might learn a skill. Learning a skill, learning an art, learning a craft is very important for creativity. It doesn't just happen by sticking people in a room and going blur whatever comes out. That is not, needless to say, how anything beautiful or great is created. So, but I do think it is very important. I absolutely agree with you, and I think that the way children are educated nowadays is adversarial to that impulse. But again, I want to caution. I don't mean that they should just be allowed to not learn things and let it all, quote, hang out. They really do need to get to grips with things, understand them, but then allowed to have their own thoughts, their own, that is what my education was like all those millions of years ago in the Dark Ages, when I was educated by wonderful people who were excited about what they were talking about, didn't have to follow a procedure that was sent to them from Whitehall. So, we need to get back to a business of, openness, and that the mind of the young person needs to be trained to think differently, not just to be indoctrinated. This is what you must say, and if you don't say these things, you won't get full marks. But no, think for yourself. Turn things on their head. See what happens. It's great.
Okay, thank you so much. And listen, we're going to have a question from Four Arrows, which you've raised a few interesting comments throughout the evening, and a chance to ask you, Iain, directly. Iain, I'll let Four Arrows answer the question, but just so you know, what my interest here is something about the nature of hierarchy that's implicit both in, or actually quite explicit in, the master and his emissary, but also to some extent in the myth with which you begin the second volume of the new book. And I'd link this as a question that sort of challenging that to some extent. Can we hear from 4 Arrows if he's there?
Yeah, I'm just asking, I'm wondering if 4 Arrows could raise their hand, then it's much easier for me to find 4 Arrows, because we have so many people here.
It's also known as Don Trent Jacobs, PhD.
Here, I see you now, 4 Arrows. Okay, here we go. Here we are.
There we go. You found me. I'm a big fan of yours, Iain, on many levels. As an Indigenous scholar, I appreciate your references to the Iroquois Confederacy as a model. Also, I have a question. That is, you're in that metaphor that Jonathan just described. I just want to be clear that you didn't intend for that relationship of hierarchy to need to be permanent in order to recognize that each person has limitations. And in the Indigenous approach, of course, hierarchy is contextual. Like for the buffalo hunt, we'll have a leader, but otherwise it's matriarchal and on. So can you clarify what you meant by that, using that particular analogy? Because it was a little bothersome.
Okay. Well, have you come across the myth that I use? Have you read it?
Yes, no. I have come across it.
Oh, you have? Yes,
I disagreed with it in a way.
Explicit in it is that there are these two unequal powers, and one is able to be creative and is able to look after the other one that can do good as long as it's under the supervision of the greater power. They are two unequal twin brothers.
Just to be clear about the question, as I understand it, that's not in doubt, and I think that's even accepted. It's just about the permanence of that relationship and whether the hierarchy is a fluid notion that comes and goes according to context, or whether it's...
Well, in that myth it isn't. No, in that myth it is a permanent fact about the relationship. It's never hinted that the other brother can somehow be the leader, because he just doesn't have what it takes. He on his own would be dangerous, and his attempts to create a negative, and he's jealous of, envious of his brother's position. He's a rival that is an upstart, basically. This is the same as the story of, Lucifer, the brightest of the angels, who became Satan, and the whole story of Paradise Lost is caused by the resentment of the one that can't do what the other one can do. Now, this is a very dangerous human reality, and I wouldn't wish to gloss over it at all.
I think that the interpretation is incorrect. It's a Western lens through which that myth is taught. And so Joseph Campbell actually talks about that myth in a different way. And I see.
I take it from Joseph Campbell. I take it direct from Joseph Campbell.
Well, then we should have a conversation about that disagreement then, right? Yeah, because the twin heroes is the key, and the twin heroes, which can that mythology is that these twins work in complementarity with different strengths and recognize the different limitations in different contexts. And so that's why I like what Jonathan is trying to clarify in terms of the fluidity. But one real brief other one. I use the left and right brain here also. I use it all the time.
Yes.
That's the problem with our world, exactly what you're saying. But science really calls our metaphor a myth, and indeed it is more complex. Can you tell how you are still using that idea of left brain hemisphere without getting too shot down by neuroscience? And then I'll close.
Well,
I think Iain, briefly on that, because we have several questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, gosh, how can I be brief? I think first of all that a myth is not an untruth, but it is a way in which the greatest truths can be expressed, and they can only be expressed through metaphors, poetry, myth, and ritual, and therefore these things are very important elements in language. They're not the stuff of science. That's not a criticism of science. Science starts out by excluding them, so that's fine. And what I've said is robust in neuroscience terms, and nobody has really said that it isn't. Okay, nobody with any authority has ever explained to me that there's anything wrong with it.
So thank you, Iain. And we're almost at the end, but there's one final question. I just want to let people know that your questions have been seen. Some of them are wonderful that we can't answer. So do know that they're appreciated. We'll keep a record of them. We may even use them in some other context. But there is a very direct question to end with, Iain, and I hope you don't mind. It's from Mel Barrett. No. And it simply says, how do you understand God?
Oh, we have minus 15 seconds for me to answer.
It's all about the resistance and all that. So
I wrote a 106-page chapter, which is woefully short on it. I can't answer that. In fact, the only decent thing to say is it can't be put into words, certainly not into the sort of expression you would like. So sorry to disappoint you, but actually that is the best expression of what I can say about it.
Okay. And the bell is the answer also. Okay. Wonderful.
The bells.
Yeah. So, listen, there are more questions. I see your hands up.
I know there are.
But it's also good to leave wanting more, and there is more to come. This is the first of several in this series. I'll be kind of anchoring most of these conversations, but there will be other people speaking to Iain at more length from different vantage points, exploring different aspects of both the books, getting a clearer sense of what we mean by attention being a moral act. So I do hope many of you will come back. A reminder to, we'll be in touch tomorrow, and to encourage you to sign up to Perspektiva's mailing list so you can hear about this series and the other work that we do. And also, again, that we are a charity. We rely on philanthropic donations. If any of you feel so inclined, you're very welcome to follow the link that we gave earlier in the chat, or that you can find on our website, to make us a donation or sign up for a subscription. It's much appreciated. And the next event in 2 weeks' time is with Zach Stein, a sort of philosopher of education, really brilliant guy who I've known for several years now. He's the author of a book called Education in a Time Between Worlds. And he is going to be asking Iain about many things, but principally this notion of the direct perception of value in the world, what's sometimes called valueception. And they'll be getting deep into what that means and why it matters today, especially. And there'll be other subsequent talks, but that's the next one. So I think, unless I've forgotten something, we're good to go, as it were.
Yeah, if I could just give a reminder, Jonathan, but next week we have a connection inquiry session, which Iain won't be present at, sadly, but it's a chance. It's more focused on connecting with the people that have been here tonight and others, and kind of structured breakout rooms and different practices to explore these ideas in greater depth. So to really kind of find the others and to create a space for that. And it will be directly related to what's been discussed tonight. So yeah, if you can make that, I put the link in the chat for the to register for that, but I'll just stick it in again. And what I'll do is just put in the link for the main kind of web page where we're going to make announcements for all of the sessions as they come up. So if you know, when you want to check back in, you can just go to that link and you'll see what the next sessions that come up and register for all the upcoming events. Great. Well, listen, Iain, as always, a huge thank you. I hope this is the first of many of these. Well, hope it will be first of many of these conversations. And thanks for everyone for coming and staying, and your questions. And sorry we couldn't get to them all. And I hope now that those who want to copy the chat have done so. And we'll see you, most of you, hopefully in a couple of weeks, maybe even in 1 week, if you're joining Michael and Lee for the connection inquiry session, which I encourage you to do, because it's good to talk, right? I mean, this heavy, heady chat, this stuff. So good to be with others who are wrestling with it too, and share your life experience and how this work comes into your world. To be a little bit less alone and maybe a bit more creative and productive through that. So pleasure to see you all, and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Iain. Be in touch soon.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll end the meeting now.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Pleasure.